Dick Clark looked like America's sweetheart, clean-cut, wholesome, the perfect host. But in 1960, during a private meeting with record executives, he reportedly said something so shocking that several co-stars walked out and never returned to American Bandstand. The statement, allegedly caught on tape and buried for decades, revealed Clark's true feelings about who belonged on his show and who did not. This wasn't about music. It was about control. What he said altered careers, destroyed friendships, and reshaped the industry. Knowing this truth makes that famous smile look very different. Dick Clark was born on November 30th, 1929, in Bronxville, New York, and raised in Mount Vernon. His father worked for radio stations, and his mother stayed at home. From an early age, Clark was fascinated by sound and speech. By the time he was 10, he had already decided he wanted a career in radio. Without waiting for permission, he built a makeshift studio in his basement, using an old stove as a microphone and his father's discarded scripts as cue cards. That small setup ignited something in him, and from that moment on, he never looked back. His smooth childhood was shattered when he was 15. In December 1944, his older brother Bradley, P-47 Thunderbolt pilot, was killed during the Battle of the Bulge. He was only 22. Dick didn't learn through a formal notice, but through neighbors arriving with condolences. The loss hardened something inside him. From that point forward, success stopped being a dream and became a duty. As the only surviving son, he felt the weight of that absence every day in a house that once held two voices and now held only one. At B. Davis High School. Clark wasn't remarkable academically, but the debate team transformed him. There he learned rhythm in words and confidence in silence, practicing how to sound calm even when his hands were shaking. People noticed his clean image and soft-spoken charm, an almost too perfect presence that inspired trust. By the time he graduated in 1947, he had already begun working in radio, starting in the mailroom at Run in Utica, New York. Though only 16, his ambition raced ahead of his age. He didn't just deliver letters. He watched, listened, and learned. When the weatherman went on vacation, Clark stepped in, reading forecasts live on air. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real, and it convinced him he belonged behind a microphone. Bradley's shadow followed him everywhere. Losing a brother in war changed how Clark viewed time. He wasn't afraid of failure. He was afraid of wasting a day. That fear drove him relentlessly. He worked weekends, stayed late, and volunteered for shifts no one wanted. Radio became more than a career path. It was his way of staying grounded and proving he could succeed without relying on his father's influence. Though his father managed the station and his uncle owned it. Clark resented the assumption that his opportunities were inherited. To avoid confusion and favoritism, he even changed his on-air name to Dick Clay during his senior year in 1950. It wasn't about shame. It was about identity. In 1947, Clark enrolled at Syracuse University with a partial scholarship, majoring in advertising with a minor in radio. Tuition was around $400 a year, still a financial stretch. So he worked weekends at Waltham for $1 an hour, spinning country records and reading news updates. By January 1951, he was hosting his own show, The Wolf Buckaroos, and crafting radio breaks with personality and rhythm. He also worked at the campus station, WAER, gaining 4 years of hands-on experience most students wouldn't see until long after graduation. Outside the studio, Clark learned how to read crowds. As a member of Delta Kappa Epsilon, he hosted sock hops and fraternity parties, charging 50 cents per person and DJing the events himself. These weren't just social gatherings. They were trial runs. Every cheer, every silence taught him something. He learned how to control energy without shouting, when to pause and when to let music speak. Those lessons followed him straight into television after graduation. Clark turned down a safe, well-paying job at an ad agency. With no backup plan, he returned to WKTV in Utica, hosting a country show called Cactus Dick and the Santa Fe Riders. The job combined weather reports, cowboy skits, and live performance, all for modest pay. When another station tried to poach him, WKTV raised his salary and Clark stayed. Though whispers followed him about family connections, he worked harder because of them. Bitterness became fuel. In 1952, Clark moved to Philadelphia to work at WFIL Radio for $35 a week. By 1954, he was substituting as host of Bandstand. When original host Bob Horn was arrested and disgraced, Clark stepped in permanently. On July 9, 1956, he hosted the televised version for the first time. Clean cut and calm, he introduced a format that clicked instantly. The audience exploded, and Clark introduced strict dress codes that appealed to sponsors, but quietly excluded poorer and marginalized teens. Behind the scenes, Clark inherited a payola system where gifts flowed in exchange for airtime. When the FCC investigated in 1959, Clark admitted to receiving gifts but denied taking cash. He avoided charges by selling his music interests and cooperating. His image was bruised but intact. What truly defined his power was his grip on youth culture. American Bandstand shaped fashion, dance, and language. A single appearance could turn an unknown song into a national hit. Yet the polish came with a cost. The show's rules quietly enforced racial and economic exclusion. Though black performers occasionally appeared, the studio audience remained overwhelmingly white. Interracial dancing was discouraged, and black teens were often turned away. Clark later claimed he didn't notice, but producers enforced strict limits behind the scenes. Keeping it clean meant keeping it safe for sponsors, and that often meant keeping it white. Clark's influence extended beyond television. He signed artists to deals that funneled royalties back to him, sometimes taking 50%. He survived the payola hearings while others were blackballed. He built an empire through production companies, award shows, and eventually Dick Clark's New Year's Rockin' Eve, which transformed New Year's Eve television forever, even as controversies followed him lawsuits. Accusations of exploitation and questions about legacy. Clark maintained control. After suffering a major stroke in 2004, he returned to television with visible effort and determination. He gradually passed the torch but never fully let go. When he died on April 18, 2012, at age 82, his estate was worth around $100 million, and his production company later sold for nearly $400 million. Dick Clark's legacy remains complicated. He reshaped American entertainment, launched countless careers, and created traditions that still endure. But behind the smile, the polish, and the countdowns, there was a system built on control, exclusion, and power. Knowing that truth changes how history remembers him and how his image should be seen, after his death, the public narrative leaned heavily toward celebration. Tributes called Dick Clark America's oldest teenager, a symbol of optimism who helped generations welcome the future. Networks replayed his countdowns. Artists thanked him for their first big break. But beneath that polished remembrance, historians and former insiders began revisiting the parts of his career that had long been minimized or ignored. When the glow of nostalgia faded, a harder question remained: who paid the price for the empire he built? Former American Bandstand dancers were among the first to speak out. For decades, they had been treated as background decoration faces without names, bodies without contracts. When Clark's company began monetizing archival footage through VHS tapes and later DVDs, many dancers were shocked to see themselves packaged and sold without consent or compensation. Lawsuits followed. Plaintiffs argued they were never informed their likenesses would be reused commercially. The cases exposed how loosely rights were handled in early television, and how Clark's business instincts often ran far ahead of ethical considerations. Even when settlements were reached, bitterness lingered. For those dancers, Bandstand had not been a launchpad, but a closed system where others profited from their presence. Journalists digging deeper into the racial dynamics of the show uncovered a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Philadelphia activists had complained as early as the late 1950s that black teens were routinely turned away at the studio door. Some were told the show was full. Others were quietly informed they didn't meet the dress code, even when dressed appropriately. The unspoken rule: one black couple per episode, if any, kept the image controlled. Clark insisted he wanted harmony, not tension. But harmony in practice meant invisibility for many. Black artists who appeared on the show described subtle but consistent marginalization. They were introduced politely, often praised for their talent, yet rarely centered. Camera angles avoided lingering shots. Dance segments placed them at the edges. Interracial interaction was minimized. Clark understood television optics better than almost anyone of his era, and he knew exactly what images would reassure nervous sponsors. That knowledge made him powerful, but it also made him complicit in reinforcing boundaries that mirrored segregation. Even after it was officially outlawed, the payola scandal never fully loosened its grip on Clark's reputation. Though he avoided criminal charges, the hearings revealed a system where influence and ownership overlapped in troubling ways. He wasn't just showcasing music, he was shaping the market to favor his own investments. By the time Congress forced him to divest, he had already made millions. Competitors who lacked his legal insulation were destroyed. Alan Freed, who openly championed black artists in integrated shows, lost everything. Clark survived, cleaner and stronger than before. That contrast became impossible to ignore, as Clark shifted into production and ownership in the 1970s and 1980s. His control only deepened. Dick Clark Productions became a quiet giant, producing award shows, specials, and game shows that emphasized predictability and sponsor safety. Staff described an environment where risks were discouraged and controversy was cut before it reached rehearsal. Scripts were reviewed repeatedly. Performers were coached to stay within invisible lines. Clark believed audiences wanted comfort, not confrontation. But comfort again came at the expense of truth. The American Music Awards became a lightning rod for criticism. While marketed as fan-voted, insiders questioned how winners were selected. Patterns emerged that favored artists aligned with Clark's business interests or with labels that maintained strong relationships with his company. Nothing illegal was proven, but suspicion followed every trophy handed out. In an industry already rife with backroom deals, Clark's reputation as the ultimate gatekeeper made transparency nearly impossible. Even New Year's Rockin' Eve, the show most associated with joy and unity, reflected Clark's philosophy of control. Performances were carefully vetted. Lyrics were sanitized. Political statements were unwelcome. In moments of chaos, whether nude protesters or technical failures, Clark's instinct was always the same: keep smiling, keep moving, never acknowledge the deeper disruption. That professionalism made him beloved, but it also revealed a refusal to engage with discomfort. Even when the culture itself was changing, by the time his health declined, Clark had already cemented his role as an institution rather than a person. His stroke humanized him in the public eye, but behind the scenes the machinery continued. Younger hosts were brought in, formats refreshed, yet the core values remained unchanged. Clean, safe, profitable. When Ryan Seacrest gradually assumed the New Year's Eve spotlight, it wasn't a revolution, it was a continuation. Clark had built something designed to outlive him. After the sale of Dick Clark Productions, more former employees came forward. Stagehands alleged unpaid overtime. Writers claimed residuals were withheld. Performers questioned contracts they hadn't fully understood. These cases painted a picture of a company that prioritized expansion over equity. None of it erased Clark's achievements, but it complicated them. Historians now place Dick Clark alongside other powerful media figures of the 20th century, men who shaped culture while quietly narrowing its boundaries. He did not invent segregation, payola, or exploitation, but he mastered navigating them without getting burned. His genius wasn't just in spotting trends. It was in making himself indispensable to systems that rewarded conformity in the end. Dick Clark's legacy is neither purely villainous nor purely heroic. He opened doors for some while closing them for others. He modernized television while freezing certain values in place. He gave America a soundtrack, but chose which voices were turned up and which stayed low. His smile reassured a nation. But behind it was a man who understood power intimately and used it with precision. Seeing Dick Clark clearly means holding both truths at once. The man who brought music into living rooms and the executive who controlled who was allowed on screen. The countdowns, the applause, the celebrations, they were real. So were the exclusions, the deals, and the silence. And once you understand that, the image of America's sweetheart is no longer simple. It's a reflection of the industry he helped build, brightly lit, carefully managed, and never quite as innocent as it appeared. Even now, decades later, the debate around Dick Clark hasn't settled. What makes his story so enduring is not just what he did, but how seamlessly he did it. He rarely raised his voice. He didn't rant or posture. He smiled, nodded, and kept the show moving. That quiet authority made him harder to challenge. In an industry built on loud personalities and public scandals, Clark mastered something far more effective: invisibility of intent. Power works best, he understood, when it doesn't look like power at all. Former executives have since admitted that. Clark's greatest skill wasn't hosting, it was risk management. He sensed cultural shifts early, but he never embraced them fully until they were safe. Rock and roll was dangerous in the 1950s, so he softened it. Black music was explosive, so he filtered it. Youth rebellion was brewing, so he repackaged it as choreography and smiles. By the time parents realized what had changed, Clark had already framed it as wholesome entertainment. He didn't stop change. He slowed it, shaped it, and sold it. That approach left lasting consequences. While American Bandstand introduced millions of white teenagers to black music, it also disconnected that music from its roots. The sound survived, but the stories were diluted. Rock and roll became a product rather than a protest. Artists who played along prospered. Those who resisted were sidelined. Some historians argue that Clark's influence delayed broader integration on television by years, even as he publicly claimed to support it. The contradiction wasn't accidental, it was strategic. Clark himself never fully reckoned with this tension. In later interviews, he described his decisions as reflections of the times, emphasizing sponsor pressure and network standards. He positioned himself as a mediator rather than a decision-maker. But documents, contracts, and testimonies suggest otherwise. He wasn't just responding to the system, he was shaping it. And he was rewarded handsomely for doing so. What complicates the narrative further is that many artists genuinely felt grateful to him. For performers from small towns or struggling labels, a single appearance on Bandstand could change everything. Clark wrote recommendation letters, facilitated contracts, and sometimes intervened when labels hesitated. To those artists, he wasn't a gatekeeper, he was a lifeline. That duality made criticism difficult. How do you condemn someone who helped so many, even if others were harmed along the way? By the late 1980s and 1990s, Clark's public image had hardened into something almost mythic. He wasn't just a host, he was tradition itself. Questioning him felt like questioning New Year's Eve or youth or nostalgia. Networks had no incentive to reopen old wounds. Advertisers preferred the legend. The audience, raised on reruns and countdowns, accepted the simplified version of history, but culture doesn't stay frozen. As conversations around representation, exploitation, and media power grew louder in the 2000s and 2010s, Clark's career began to be reevaluated through a different lens. What once looked like professionalism now looked like suppression. What once felt neutral now appeared selective. The very skills that made him successful, control, polish. Restraint became the reasons his legacy felt incomplete. Clark didn't fall from grace because he never truly stood in a place where grace could be withdrawn. He exited quietly, shielded by time and reputation. That may be his final, most revealing achievement. He built a career that resisted collapse, even under scrutiny. No single scandal ended him. No, quote, fully exposed him. The truth emerged slowly in fragments after the cameras moved on. In the end, Dick Clark represents a specific kind of American success story, one built not on confrontation, but on calibration. He knew exactly how far to go and when to stop. He sensed where the line was and made a career out of never crossing it publicly. Even if others were pushed back behind it, remembering him honestly doesn't mean erasing the joy he created or denying the opportunities he provided. It means acknowledging the full cost of that joy. The missed chances, the silenced dancers, the filtered faces, the artists who never made it on stage because they didn't fit the image. Dick Clark didn't just host America's youth. He curated it. And once you see that clearly, story stops being a simple tale of success and becomes something far more revealing, a lesson in how power, when wrapped in a smile, can shape culture for generations without ever asking permission.